Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Words taken from the 18th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. The lectionary for Trinity XI is rooted in the love of God, duty towards God, and the grace that enables us to love God and to do our duty. On the 11th Sunday after Trinity, we are taught the tools to embrace God's grace. The gospel exhorts us to conquer pride and embrace humility. Pride is the deadliest of all the mortal sins and threatens to land us in hellfire and damnation. Humility is the chief of all virtues, which opens our souls to God's grace. Humility must conquer all pride if we hope to reach the kingdom of heaven. Pride is a difficult habit to shake. Humility is a difficult virtue to acquire. Aristotle reminds us that we become good by doing good things. His point is that we must form and practice good habits, virtues. In this morning's gospel, Christ shares a parable with us to illustrate the cause for either pride or humility. We read that two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. Jesus tells us this about the first man, the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood thus and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week and give tithes of all that I possess. The Pharisee stands in a place of prominence so that others might notice him at prayer. He's much like contemporary Christians who take the front seats in church so that people may see how important they imagine themselves to be. He also segregates himself from the immoral and unclean who must pray at the back. His words reveal the heart of the matter. God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are. He measures his life not against God's perfect purity, but in relation to other men. Unconscious of any sin that would need mercy, he thanks God that he is not a sinner and calls upon God to bless his pristine life. He even notices the publican at the back of the temple looking down and beating his breast, and concludes that this man's sins must be especially notorious. Not content with listing the sins he avoids, he also tells us what virtues he practices. He fasts twice in a week, more than the law required, and give tithes of all that he possesses, even beyond the produce and cattle, to include his income, gold. He thinks himself not just good, but very good. His performance must hide any hint of weakness from himself, from other men, and from God. Beneath it all, he's insecure, and so he must continually calculate evidence of his quantitative goodness and parade it before others. Next we see the publican. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The publican has nothing to count. He has little to say on his own behalf. He can lift neither his head nor his hands up to heaven. He's full of remorse and sadness because he knows that his iniquities are increased over his head, and his trespass is grown up unto the heavens. He's honest about himself and the condition of his soul. He knows how He knows how far short he falls of what God requires. Compared to what God expects of him, he has failed. He judges himself by God alone and cannot compare himself with all other men. From God alone he begs mercy, because from God alone can he find grace to help in time of need. His prostration and humility alone can open the door of God's healing. He stood afar off, not because he was forbidden to come closer, but because he feared the pride that could come from places of prominence. God alone invites us to come up higher. He smote upon his breast, knowing that because of his sins, God might smite him right into hell. He's not insecure. He's honest. He does not despair. As far from God as he has traveled, still he hopes for God's mercy. Jesus tells us that this man, the publican, went down to his house justified, and not the Pharisee. Justified means made right with God. Went down to his house means having received the forgiveness of God in time and space, and not only in heaven. Here and now, not in the future. This man was justified as forgiven, and thus senses the inward presence and operation of God's grace. St. Paul reinforces this same truth this morning. Once a proud Pharisee who persecuted the church, he was thrown from the high horse of self-righteousness on the Damascus road. Thereafter he called himself the least of the apostles, and labored more abundantly only by the grace of God that was with him. His self-conscious righteousness had been put to death. He had been a Pharisee of the Pharisees. His self-conscious righteousness had been put to death. For only then could grace do its work in his heart. Where then do we stand this morning? Do we come before God measuring ourselves against others? Quietly thankful that we are not as this one or that one? There's a lot of pride in our world. Unself-conscious pride. Present but not noticed, because most men are too busy pointing the fingers at others. Do we come before God measuring ourselves against others? I thank thee, God, that I am not as other men are, especially that poor publican. Or do we stand afar off, unwilling to lift our eyes, because we simply cry for mercy? The parable leaves us no middle ground. If we would receive God's grace that alone enables us to run in the way of his commandments, we must take the publican's place and make his prayer our own. God be merciful to me, a sinner, the chief, the chiefest, the greatest of sinners. Don't worry about what other people are going to think about us. Who cares? If they're judging us by our confession of sin and humility, shame on them. And they're in for a rude awakening. Leave them alone. We've got to work on this. On the great and dreadful day of judgment, there will be no cheerleading squads. There will be Jesus against me. Jesus interrogating me. Jesus weighing and measuring my life in relation to his own to see if he recognizes enough of himself in me so that I might be welcomed into the kingdom. God's grace alone enables us to run the way of his commandments and to lay hold of his promises and to become partakers of his heavenly treasure, as today's collect says. That grace is given to those who, with the publican, take the lowest place, beat the breast, claim no goodness of their own, and cry, God be merciful to me, a sinner. The chief, the chiefest, the greatest of sinners. Amen.